The first time I heard the Harmon children laugh, it was not in play, and it was not in joy. It came from behind a closed parlor door near midnight, a soft chorus of giggles that rose and fell in a rhythm too even, like rehearsed music. I stood in the hallway holding a lamp I had not meant to carry that far, and I remember the way the flame shook without wind, as if the air itself was breathing wrong. Then the laughter stopped all at once. A chair scraped, something heavy thumped against the floor, and a man's voice, low and patient, began to speak to them the way a pastor might speak to a congregation that has already decided to follow him anywhere. I did not know his name yet. I only knew I had stepped into a house where rules were being rewritten in the dark, and by the time I learned what that voice was teaching those children, I understood that the true horror in the South did not always come from whips or war or swamp ghosts. Sometimes it came from a man with a book, a soft smile, and the power to turn a family into his instruments. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. And if this is your first time here at Tales Never Told, don't forget to subscribe for more true and unsettling stories that history tried to bury. In the spring of 1857, long before cannon smoke would stain the horizon, the low country of South Carolina wore a kind of quiet that felt eternal. Rice fields fanned out beside the Cooper River like green glass, broken only by the silhouettes of live oaks and the tall chimneys of sugar houses. The Harmon plantation sat north of Charleston on land so flat the sky seemed closer there than anywhere else. It was not one of the grandest estates, but it was rich enough to demand respect. The Harmons owned nearly 70 enslaved people and a river dock where barges moved grain toward the city. Their big house was whitewashed wood with a wide veranda, a place that looked gentle from a distance, the way a snake looks like rope until it moves. The head of that household was Augustus Harmon, a man in his early 50s with a soldier's posture, left over from a youth spent in militia drills. His hair was iron gray, his jaw wide, and his eyes carried the exhausted sharpness of someone who had spent a lifetime counting profit and threat in the same breath. His wife, Eliza, was younger by 12 years and seemed to have been born for drawing rooms and hymnals, not for swamps and ledgers. Folks in Charleston said she had a delicate heart and a mind that drifted easily into melancholy. That rumor was true, but it was not the whole truth. The Harmon children were the pride of the household. There were 3 of them. Nathaniel, the eldest, was 17 and already trained to ride the fields with an overseer at his side. Lydia was 15, bright and eager, favored by her mother. And little James, not yet 11, had a habit of eavesdropping on adult talk with the silent attentiveness of someone who reads. Danger before letters. I met the family that spring because I had been sent from St. Bridget Parish in Charleston to assist Reverend Mallory, the plantation chaplain, who had taken ill with a fever that left him weak and coughing blood. My assignment was simple on paper: hold Sunday services in the big house for the white family, visit the quarters for prayer among the enslaved, offer last rites if the fever took Mallory before he recovered. I had done similar work before. Plantations were their own small nations, and a traveling priest learned to move through them carefully. What I did not expect was to find a stranger seated at the Harmon table on my first evening there. He was not family. He was not a planter neighbor. He was dressed in a dark suit too fine for the heat, with a high collar that made his neck look long and almost swan-like. He rose when I entered, smiling as if we were old friends. Augustus introduced him as Mr. Adrian Blackwood, the new tutor. He had been hired from Charleston to teach Latin, French, arithmetic, and manners to the children, preparing Nathaniel for university and the younger 2 for whatever polished future Eliza dreamed about. Adrian bowed to me with a kind of careful grace. His voice was soft, educated, and pleasant. Yet there was something in his manner that felt staged, like he had practiced every blink in a mirror. Eliza, pale and tired, spoke about how grateful she was to have found a tutor so refined. She said Adrian had excellent references from a church school in Virginia. Augustus nodded, but watched Adrian the way a farmer watches a horse. he has not yet decided to trust. The children hovered near the tutor with particular intensity. Nathaniel watched him like a rival. Lydia watched him like a star. James watched him like a puzzle he could not stop turning over in his small hands. That first meal was uneventful on the surface. They spoke about crops, about shipping rates, about Charleston society. Adrian offered a thoughtful comment here and there, never too much, never too little. But I noticed something that sat wrong in my gut. Every time a servant entered the dining room, Adrian tracked them with his eyes, not like a man admiring human beings, and not like a man contemptuous of property. It was something colder, like a naturalist observing a specimen. When dinner ended, Adrian excused himself to begin lessons the following morning. He wished me a restful night. His smile never reached his eyes. Afterward, Eliza confided in me that Adrian had arrived only 2 weeks earlier and already seemed to have a special talent for calming the children, especially James, who had been having nightmares. She said the tutor read to them at night from poetry and moral stories, and that the sound of his voice soothed the entire house. She laughed softly, calling him a blessing. Augustus did not laugh. He said, "Blessings come and go. We will see what kind of man he is by summer." I asked if anything had happened to make him cautious. Augustus looked at me for a long moment, then said he had a habit of being cautious about anyone who came close to his heirs. He called it a father's duty. The word duty hung in the air, heavy as humidity. I went to my room believing that was the end of it. Then came that midnight laughter in the parlor, the sudden silence, and the tutor voice teaching something I was not meant to hear. That night I did not sleep. The lamp I brought back to my room sat on the washstand, and every time the flame dipped I felt sure I would hear the parlor door open. But the house stayed quiet. Only the slow tick of the hallway clock and the faint river frogs outside kept time. At dawn, I went to the small chapel room. The Harmons kept off the main hall, and I prayed for discernment, because I could not name what had troubled me. When breakfast came, Adrian was already at the table, fresh and composed, as if he had slept under a bell jar. He greeted me warmly, asked after Reverend Mallory, and inquired about my parish work in Charleston with a curiosity that felt flattering at first. Yet even there, in full morning light, I caught the shadow of last night in the way the Harmon children looked at him. Their eyes were too fixed, their bodies too still. It reminded me of the way altar boys watch for a priest's cue, waiting to move only when he wills it. Lessons began after breakfast in the study. I passed the open door once and saw Adrian standing at the chalkboard, a book open in one hand. He was explaining something about Roman virtue, about sacrifice and honor, and Nathaniel listened with a tightening jaw, as if he were drinking medicine he did not want but had decided to swallow anyway. Lydia leaned forward, practically glowing. James sat with his small hands folded and his head tilted, his face bare of expression. It was a posture I had seen in sickbeds when a child is too tired to survive anything but listening. I went to the quarters after that because Reverend Mallory had always insisted that morning visits were best, before the field work took all strength from the body. The quarters at Harmon Plantation were arranged in 2 long rows of cabins with a muddy lane between, and they smelled of smoke, damp wood, and the faint sweetness of rice mash. The people there knew me by collar more than by name, but they were polite. I prayed with an elderly woman named Rose who had lost a grandson to fever last year. I spoke with a man called Ben who had a crushed hand from a mill gear. I listened to their whispered worries about the coming season. None of that was unusual, but as I turned to leave, I heard a sound from behind one cabin that made me stop. It was singing, but not a hymn. It was a children's rhyme, thin and lilting, the sort of melody a tutor might teach to help memorize French vowels. I walked around the cabin and found Lydia and James sitting on an overturned barrel, while 4 enslaved children watched them. Lydia was reciting lines in French, clapping her hands in a steady beat. The enslaved children were repeating after her, hesitant at first, then more confident as she praised them. James watched without speaking, his eyes moving between their mouths and their hands. Adrian stood nearby under a sweet gum tree, holding a small notebook. He smiled at me when he noticed me. He said he believed education was a form of mercy and that allowing the young in the quarters to learn simple language would improve their souls. The way he said souls made my skin prickle. It was not devotion, I heard. It was ownership disguised as compassion. I told him education was the work of the church and that I admired his impulse. He bowed again, thanked me for my guidance, and called the Harmon children back to the house. The enslaved children scattered like birds with stones thrown at them. As they ran, one small girl looked back at James with a face strained by confusion and, I think now, quiet fear. Her name was Ada. Remember her. By the first week of May, Reverend Mallory worsened. Fever thinned him to a shadow. He could not sit upright for long without coughing, and in those coughs I heard the wet rattle of a man already halfway to earth. I spent hours beside him in the back guest room, cool cloth on his brow, reading scripture when he was lucid enough to follow. In those quiet hours, he told me, he did not trust Adrian Blackwood. He said the tutor had arrived with letters that seemed proper, but felt too perfect. He said he had never seen a man weave himself into a household so quickly. And he said something else that I did not understand until later. He told me that in the evenings when he would drift between sleep and fevered dreams, he heard Adrian speaking to the children in the library, not about lessons, but about a kind of purity brought through trial. He said the words were gentle, but the tone was that of a man turning a key in a lock he intended to use. Mallory was not a superstitious man. Hearing him afraid made my own unease harden. I asked Augustus about the tutor in private that afternoon. We stood on the veranda watching field hands move like dark seeds against the green. Augustus admitted Adrian had a way of stirring conversation toward matters of morality and fate. He said Nathaniel had begun repeating some of Adrian's ideas at dinner, speaking about a family mission, about the Southern way being chosen by Providence, about future sacrifices required to preserve honor. Augustus had laughed at first, assuming it was youthful dramatics, but then he noticed the way Adrian watched him when those things were said, measuring his response. Augustus asked if I thought the tutor was dangerous. I told him I could not judge without evidence. Augustus nodded slow and said, "Evidence was hard to find when a man wore good manners like armor. The first real evidence did not come from the big house. It came from the river." Late May brought a hard rain that swelled the Cooper past its banks. The Kia dock hands worked through the night stacking crates out of reach of floodwater. At sunrise, a boy from the quarters ran up to the house shouting, and by the time I reached the river with Augustus and two overseers, we found the body of a young enslaved man wedged against a cypress root. His name was Isaiah. He was 19. His skull was split on one side, not by driftwood but by something sharper. Ben, the man with the crushed hand, knelt near the body and swore Isaiah could swim like an otter and would never drown so close to shore. The overseers muttered about whiskey and carelessness. Augustus frowned and ordered the body brought back for burial. In the chaos, I saw Nathaniel standing apart on the dock, his shirt sleeves rolled, his face pale. He looked not shocked, but quietly satisfied, as if something he had expected had finally happened. When I met his eyes, he flinched like I had caught him stealing. At dinner that night, Eliza wept softly, speaking about how tragic it was, how storms had become cruel lately. Adrian spoke gentle consolation. He said death was a kind of sorting, and that the Almighty used water to wash away what threatened a household. Lydia listened with wide eyes. James ate without a sound. Nathaniel drank more than usual. I watched their faces and felt something in me turn cold. 2 days later, I went to the quarters to say prayers for Isaiah. There I learned a detail that had not surfaced in front of the household. Isaiah had been on dock duty with Nathaniel and 2 other enslaved men. They had argued earlier that night. The argument was about Ada, the small girl who had looked back at James. Isaiah had pulled her away from the big house lane after she was caught practicing French words near the laundry shed. He told her she should not follow the Harmon children into their games. Nathaniel had heard him scold her. Witnesses said Nathaniel grew angry and told Isaiah he had no right to dictate where a child walked. Isaiah answered that he had a right to keep her safe. Those words were the last anyone heard Isaiah speak before he went to the river with Nathaniel. Nobody said Nathaniel killed him, but nobody said he did not. Around that same time, I began to notice small changes in the Harmon children that could not be explained by grief or youth. Lydia, once flighty and talkative, grew solemn. She carried Adrian's books everywhere, especially a thin volume of moral essays he called The Mirror of Virtue. She quoted its phrases like scripture. She began volunteering to help her mother with household accounts, studying lists of supplies and slave inventories with an intensity that felt older than her years. James stopped playing. He stopped asking me about saints and miracles. When I tried to engage him, he answered politely, but his eyes slid away toward the library as if something there was calling him with a voice only he could hear. Nathaniel became restless, riding hard, snapping at servants, speaking in sudden bursts about discipline and order. At times I saw Adrian place a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder and speak quietly, and I watched Nathaniel's tension loosen like a knot cut by a blade. One evening in early June, Eliza invited me to take tea in the parlor. She looked thinner than when I arrived, her cheeks hollowed by anxiety she had not named. She asked me if I believed the devil could enter a house through the thoughts of its children. I told her, evil found many doors, but the grace of God was stronger. She nodded, then said she feared something was changing in her home. She said Adrian was kind, yes, but that kindness felt like a net. She said she awoke at night to hear the children chanting phrases in Latin, sometimes laughing, sometimes whispering like conspirators. When she opened her bedroom door to listen, the chanting stopped. She said her children no longer confided in her. She said Nathaniel had begun supervising punishment in the quarters on his own initiative. She said Lydia had asked to see her mother's jewelry box for no reason and then stared at a pearl brooch as if measuring it for a coffin. I asked if Augustus shared her concerns. She shook her head. She said Augustus trusted tutors and priests to keep the children on the right path. She said she was afraid to accuse a man without proof. She reached for my hand, and her fingers were cold. She asked me to watch Adrian, discreetly, for the sake of her children. I promised her I would. That promise sits on my chest even now because I did not keep it well enough. I began spending more time in the library under the pretense of looking for hymnal references. Adrian welcomed my presence. He spoke to me about philosophy and morality without prompting. He referenced St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas with ease, but he added secular thinkers too, men who believed society must be shaped by force for its own salvation. He said families were miniature kingdoms and that weak kingdoms invited chaos. He spoke about the war coming, not as a tragedy but as an opportunity for strong souls to rise. He told me he believed the Harmons were destined for a special role in the new South that would emerge. He said he was preparing them for that role. His eyes glittered when he spoke. The glitter was not faith, it was hunger. One afternoon, I found a page in the wastebasket near Adrian's desk. It was ripped from a notebook. On it, he had drawn a circle, and inside that circle were written the names of Harmon family members, including Eliza, arranged like points on a wheel. Beside each name, he had scribbled single words. For Augustus, the word was authority. For Eliza, the word was weakness. For Nathaniel, the word was flame. For Lydia, the word was vessel. For James, the word was door. There were also names of enslaved people I recognized from the quarters: Isaiah, Ada, Rose, Ben. Next to Isaiah he had written impurity. Next to Ada he had written seed. The handwriting was neat and controlled. I stood there holding that paper, while my mind tried to find any interpretation that was not terrible. Adrian entered behind me without a sound. He looked over my shoulder and smiled. He said that page was part of a lesson on moral categories, and that I should not misread a pedagogical tool as something sinister. His voice was so calm, so reasonable, that I nearly believed him. I apologized and dropped the page back into the basket. He thanked me for my humility. Then, before I could leave, he asked if I had ever seen a flock of sheep driven by a dog. I said yes, of course. He said the dog did not hate the sheep. The dog loved the flock so much it would bite them to keep them from cliffs. He said he wished more men of God understood that love and pain were sometimes welded together. He watched my face for a reaction. I gave none, but inside I felt the air thicken. The second death came mid-June. A young enslaved woman named Charity was found in the canebrake behind the old smokehouse, her throat opened by a clean cut and her hands tied with twine. The twine was Harmon twine. The cut was too precise for field tools. The overseer blamed a runaway band passing through. Augustus rode with men to search the woods and returned empty. The quarters grieved in quiet terror. They were also angry. I sat with Rose while she rocked and whispered psalms. She told me softly that Isaiah and Charity had both been punished by Nathaniel in the past week for minor things, and that Nathaniel had spoken to him about honor and servitude in a way she had never heard before, using phrases that sounded like Adrian's lessons. Rose said Nathaniel had told Charity the plantation needed to become clean and that certain souls were stains. Rose had asked who taught him to talk that way. Nathaniel had looked at her and smiled. He said, "Someone who knows the future." I went to Augustus that night with what I had learned. I told him Charity had likely been killed by someone inside his household. I told him Nathaniel's behavior had changed. Augustus' face darkened. He said I was asking him to imagine his son a murderer. I said yes, because the alternative was ignoring a truth that would rot his family from within. Augustus rose from his chair like a man being pulled by a rope. He called Nathaniel into the study. Adrian followed. When I entered behind them, I found Augustus, demanding to know where Nathaniel had been the night Charity died. Nathaniel answered steadily, saying he had been with Adrian in the library, studying a moral text about Stoic virtue. Adrian confirmed. Augustus stared at them both. He turned to Adrian and said he appreciated the tutor's care, but that from now on, Nathaniel would not be left alone in the quarters without oversight. Adrian bowed and said, "Of course." Yet as he bowed, his eyes slid to Nathaniel with a subtle satisfaction, a silent exchange that made me feel I had just watched a man train a hound to lie. After that confrontation, Adrian's influence only tightened. He began keeping the children in lessons later into the night. He requested private talks with each child separately. He began walking the property at odd hours with Nathaniel at his side, pointing out things in the landscape, the way a commander points out terrain to a soldier. He took Lydia to the quarters again, insisting she bring Ada, because he said her clever tongue might inspire others. Ada went unwillingly, her shoulders hiked as if bracing for impact. I saw James standing at his bedroom window watching them go, his face pressed close to the glass. The look on his face was not jealousy, it was dread. In late June, I finally confronted Adrian alone. I told him I had concerns about the nature of his teachings. I told him his words about cleansing and sorting could turn a boy's mind toward cruelty. He listened as if I were reading him a shopping list. When I finished, he asked if I believed God had ever commanded violence. I said Scripture was full of hard truths, but those commands were not ours to imitate without divine authority. He smiled and said, "Divine authority often came through human instruments." He said I was a good priest, but perhaps too sentimental about the souls of those who threatened a household. He asked me if I had ever watched a sick tree infect a grove. He said sometimes the axe was the only mercy. He said the children were learning to wield axes the world would soon demand they lift. I told him that was not education, it was indoctrination. He laughed softly and said the difference between education and indoctrination depended on who held the pen of history. He leaned forward and lowered his voice. He said I should leave Harmon Plantation when Reverend Mallory died, because my presence was beginning to confuse the children. He said they respected me, and that respect might make them hesitate when hesitation could cost their souls. I felt a chill pass through me, despite the heat. I asked what he meant. He said only that he was preparing a family for trials I could not imagine. He stood, ending the conversation with a politeness that felt like a door closing on my fingers. In early July, Reverend Mallory died. He died quietly at dusk with my hand on his forehead and Eliza murmuring a prayer from the doorway. His last words were not to me. He looked past me, eyes clouded, and whispered, "He is the wolf in the schoolroom." Then his breath went out and did not return. After the burial, Augustus offered to keep me through the season, but Adrian wanted my room for a visiting scholar he claimed would arrive soon to assist with Nathaniel examinations. The request was framed as practical necessity. Augustus agreed with reluctance. Eliza begged me with her eyes to stay, but she did not speak. I told Augustus I had obligations in Charleston and would return in a week to check on the family. That was a lie meant to buy me time. I left the plantation on a humid morning, and as the carriage rolled down the oak lane, I looked back and saw Adrian standing on the veranda with the children. He raised a hand in farewell. Nathaniel and Lydia stood close, shoulders squared. James stood a step behind them, small and pale. As I looked back, James lifted his hand too, not waving but holding his palm out toward me, as if asking for help from a great distance. In Charleston, I went straight to Father Delacroix at St. Bridget, the senior priest who supervised my work. I told him everything. I told him about Isaiah, Charity, Adrian's circle diagram, Eliza fear, Nathaniel behavior. Father Delacroix listened with a face that tightened. When I finished, he said I was suggesting a wealthy planter's son and tutor were murdering enslaved people. He said such accusations could bring ruin on the church if made without iron proof. He told me to be careful. He told me to pray. He told me that families were sovereign within their walls, and a priest who overstepped could be expelled from the region entirely. His words were cautious, but not cruel. He believed he was protecting me. Yet I felt church law settle over my shoulders like a wet cloak. I could not wait for iron proof. People were dying. So I returned to Harmon Plantation sooner than I said I would, traveling alone on horseback the next afternoon. When I arrived, the big house was quiet. The shutters were half closed, even though the sun was high. A servant led me to the parlor where Eliza sat stiffly by the fireplace, hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were red but dry. She rose when she saw me and nearly collapsed from relief. She said things were worse. She said Nathaniel had taken an overseer role without Augustus' permission. She said Lydia spent whole days with Adrian in the library, reading passages about classical virtue and something Adrian called the ethics of dominion. She said James had stopped speaking in full sentences. When she asked him what he learned, he told her only, "We must be ready." She said Ada had disappeared the night before. She whispered it like a confession she was ashamed to voice. I asked who had last seen Ada. Eliza said Lydia had brought her to the kitchen that morning to practice French and then sent her back to the quarters with a basket of bread. Ada never arrived. The quarter mothers were frantic, but Nathaniel ordered them to stop searching because it upset the work. He told them Ada likely ran off to hide because she was disobedient. Eliza said she did not believe that. She said Ada was a timid child who would not leave her own mother. She asked me to find Augustus. He was out riding. Adrian was in the study. I went to the quarters myself. The lane between cabins was churned by frantic feet. Women were crying. Men stood with jaws clenched, glancing toward the big house as if they wanted to burn it down with their eyes. Ada Mother, a young woman named Millie, clutched my sleeve and begged me to help. She said Ada had been different since the tutor began bringing the Harmon children to teach them songs. She said Ada told her the white children were learning a game about wolves and lambs, and that in the game, lambs that did not bow were taken into the woods and turned into shadows. Millie said Ada had woken screaming from dreams where Lydia stood over her holding a candle and smiling. I asked if anyone saw Ada after breakfast. A boy said he saw Lydia and Ada near the old carriage shed. He said Adrian was there too, carrying a small lantern even though it was daylight. They walked toward the swamp path. The boy did not follow because he was afraid. I followed the swamp path alone. It cut through tall grass and mossy trunks into a darker world where light died early even at noon. The air there smelled of rot and sweet water. After a mile, I found something that made my knees go weak. It was a ribbon, pale blue, tied in a neat bow around a cypress branch. I had seen that ribbon in Lydia hair 2 days earlier. A few yards beyond, half buried in mud, I found a small shoe. It was Ada's shoe. The toe was scuffed. The laces were still tied. I kept walking. The path ended near a sinkhole pool where black water lay still as oil. There were footprints in the mud. One set was small and barefoot. One set was booted, large matching Nathaniel boots. One set was narrow, heel-deep, likely Adrian's. There was also a drag mark leading toward the water. I stood there, listening to the insects. I called for Ada. My voice was swallowed. I knew then I was already too late. When I returned to the plantation with the shoe and ribbon, I went straight to Augustus' study. Adrian was there, sitting calmly, a book open before him. Augustus had returned and stood by the window with a face like carved stone. Nathaniel was at his side. Lydia sat in a chair, hands folded, eyes shining in a way that made her look fevered. James stood behind her, thumb in his mouth, staring at the floor. I placed the shoe on the desk. I spoke plainly. I said Ada was dead or in danger. I said the footprints led to the sinkhole. I said I believed Nathaniel and Adrian knew what happened. The room went silent in the way a church goes silent when a man confesses murder. Augustus turned to Nathaniel and asked if he had taken Ada into the swamp. Nathaniel did not answer at first. Then he said yes, but not alone. He said he had obeyed Adrian's instruction. He said Ada had been chosen for a test. Eliza, who had entered behind me, gasped and clutched the doorframe. Augustus asked what test. Adrian closed his book gently and said this was a family matter and that I had no right to force explanation. I told him I had a right to protect a child. Adrian smiled and said, "The child was not mine to protect." He said the Harmons were performing a necessary work of purification. Augustus spun on him, furious now, demanding to know what he had done to his son and daughter minds. Adrian looked at Augustus with patient pity. He said Augustus had always feared chaos and that he had taught his children how to fight it. He said Ada was a seed of disorder, a child who had begun to imagine herself equal because she was being taught language and songs. He said such imagining was poison. He said the only cure was demonstration, and that demonstration would bind the Harmon children to their future roles. He said he had led them to the sinkhole and told them to choose whether they would preserve their household or weaken it. He said Nathaniel, as heir, made the correct choice. Augustus staggered as if struck. He looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel stared back, chest rising and falling hard. He said he did not want to do it at first. He said Ada cried and begged. He said Lydia told her to be brave. He said Adrian spoke softly about honor. Then Nathaniel said the words that ended the world as I had known it. He said that when he pushed Ada into the water, he felt a kind of peace he had never felt before. Eliza screamed and rushed toward her son. Nathaniel flinched away. Adrian stood between them with a hand lifted like a judge. He said Eliza must not spoil the lesson. He said pity was a disease worse than rebellion. Augustus drew a pistol from the desk drawer. He pointed it at Adrian, handshaking. He told Adrian to leave his house at once. Adrian did not move. He said Augustus had hired him to shape these children, and that shaping could not be undone by sentiment. He said if Augustus killed him, the children would be left half awakened, wandering between worlds. He said the household would fracture. Then he said something else, quieter, aimed like a needle. He said perhaps Augustus was afraid to admit the family needed this hardness, because Augustus himself had always been weak in spirit. That word weak hit Augustus like black magic. I watched the man's face shift. Rage, humiliation, fear, all mixed. His finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, Lydia moved. She rose from her chair and placed her hand on Augustus' wrist. She said, "Father, you will not harm our guide." She said it clear as day, with a calm that was not her own. She said Adrian had shown them the truth about their duty. She said they were being made ready for the war and for the new world after. She said Ada was a sacrifice for the greater good. Eliza slapped Lydia hard across the face. Lydia did not cry. She turned her cheek back toward her mother and said, "You are the stain." James began to giggle softly. Not a child's giggle. A thin, pleased sound. Augustus lowered the pistol an inch. Adrian stepped closer and said, "You see now what is at stake." Augustus whispered, "What have you done to them?" Adrian said, "I have freed them from softness." Augustus looked at me as if asking whether he was dreaming. I told him this man needed to be removed at once, and that the children needed distance and prayer before more blood was shed. Adrian laughed again. He said prayer could not reverse awakening. He said the dog had already bitten the sheep for their own good. He told Augustus to sit and think, and he would forgive this outburst of doubt. Augustus snapped back into himself for a moment. He raised the pistol again, but this time, Nathaniel moved fast. He grabbed Augustus' arm, wrenched it downward, and struck his father in the jaw with the heel of his palm. Augustus fell against the desk, the pistol clattering. I rushed forward, but Nathaniel shoved me back. He was sobbing and furious at once. He told Augustus he was unworthy to lead now. He said Adrian had shown him that fathers who hesitated were traitors to their own blood. He said the household needed a new order. Lydia stood beside Adrian like a loyal acolyte. James kept giggling. Eliza knelt over Augustus, weeping. Adrian said the demonstration was complete. He said the family would take a walk together that evening and discuss the next steps. I knew then that if I stayed inside those walls, I would be dead before supper. I left the study to find help. The carriage horses were still in their stalls. I saddled one myself with shaking hands. As I mounted, I heard a shout behind me. It was Ben from the quarters. He had seen the turmoil. I told him Ada was gone and that Adrian had led the children into murder. Ben's face turned to stone. He said, "We knew a devil come when he started teaching babies French. He asked what he could do. I told him to gather trusted men and keep families close. I told him to be ready to run to the swamp if the big house turned on the quarters. He nodded without question. I rode hard to the nearest county outpost. Sheriff Langley was not there, but a deputy named Harlow listened to me with a skeptical expression. I told him a child had been murdered, that a tutor had incited it, that Augustus Harmon was in danger. The deputy asked if I had proof. I said I had a shoe, a confession, and a house of lunacy. He said those were not enough to defy a wealthy planter unless there was blood on a white floor. I begged him to come anyway. He finally agreed to bring 2 men at dawn. Dawn was too late. I turned the horse around and rode back through the night. When I arrived near midnight, the plantation was not quiet. It was alive with the sound of movement. Lanterns bobbed near the quarters. People were running. I dismounted and hurried toward the cabins. Rose grabbed me, saying Nathaniel had come with a rifle and ordered every able man to gather in the lane. She said he was accusing the quarters of hiding Ada and plotting revenge. She said Adrian had told him rebellion was coming and must be crushed before it was born. She said Nathaniel had already struck a man named Solomon for speaking out. I pushed through the crowd and found Nathaniel standing on a barrel, rifle in hand, shouting about loyalty. Adrian stood behind him in the lantern light, hands clasped, expression serene. Lydia was there too, holding a small Bible and quoting verses about servants obeying masters. James hovered at her skirt, eyes wide, smiling faintly as if this were a play put on for him. I stepped into the lane and demanded Nathaniel stop. He swung the rifle toward me. His face was slack with zeal. He said I had returned to interfere again. He said the quarters were diseased. He said tonight would be a cleansing. Adrian raised a hand gently, and Nathaniel lowered the rifle, just enough to listen. Adrian approached me and asked why I had not taken his advice to leave. I said because he had turned children into killers. He sighed and said, killers were only people who made hard choices for soft souls. He said the quarters would be disciplined now and that afterward there could be peace. I said there could be no peace built on murder. Lydia stepped forward and said, peace required obedience, and obedience required fear. Her voice was not trembling. It was bright and sure. I looked at Eliza in the crowd, hoping to find a mother's rebellion. But Eliza was not there. She was locked in her room after striking Lydia, according to a servant who whispered to me. Augustus was in the study, jaw swollen, and had not been allowed to leave. I realized I was not just fighting a tutor, I was fighting a transformed household. The first shot did not come from Nathaniel. It came from someone in the dark trees beyond the lane. A rifle cracked. Nathaniel stumbled. Blood bloomed on his shoulder. The crowd screamed and scattered. Ben had done it. He shot not to kill, but to stop. In the chaos, Ben and two others rushed Nathaniel, dragging him off the barrel. Adrian shouted for order, but the enslaved men surged like a flood. Lydia screamed for them to stop, calling them animals, calling them traitors. James began to cry, a high, frightened wail that sounded like a bell rung in a storm. Adrian lunged toward Nathaniel with a knife drawn from his coat, perhaps to finish the work himself, perhaps to prevent his instrument from waking. I stepped into his path. The knife flashed toward my ribs. I grabbed his wrist. He was stronger than he looked. We fell into the mud. I felt the knife nick my side. He hissed in my face that I was ruining everything. I shouted for help. Hands pulled him off. Ben and others pinned Adrian to the ground. His composure shattered. He thrashed and spat and cursed them in words that were not English, not Latin, something older and harsher. Lydia threw herself at Ben, clawing and screaming, but Rose and Millie held her back. James ran toward the big house, sobbing. In the lantern light, Adrian looked up at me with eyes empty of mercy. He said, "You think this ends a lesson? It only changes the classroom." Then he laughed again, and that laugh was the same sound I had heard in the parlor weeks earlier, the sound of a door closing on human feeling. They tied Adrian with rope and carried him to the old tool shed. Ben asked what should be done. I said we needed the law now because if they killed him themselves, the county would hang every man who touched him. Ben listened. He had already risked his life. Yet he nodded, because he wanted justice more than revenge. We kept Adrian in the shed all night. He did not sleep. He sang low songs in that strange tongue. He whispered through the boards to the children in the big house, promising them the work would continue. At dawn, the deputy arrived with 2 men. They found a plantation in turmoil and a tutor bound like a hog. I showed them the shoe. I told them of the confession. I showed them my bleeding side for proof of his knife. The deputy looked at Adrian, and then at Augustus, who had been carried out pale and shaking, and finally at Lydia, who stood stiff as marble, watching her tutor with a stare that broke my heart. The deputy arrested Adrian. He also arrested Ben for shooting Nathaniel. Augustus begged him not to. He said Ben had saved lives. The deputy said the law was the law. He put chains on Ben anyway, as they dragged Adrian toward the wagon. Adrian spoke one last time to the Harmon children. He told them that a true heir does not weep for a fallen guide, and that the true work was inside them now. He told them to remember Ada's face as a holy seal. Lydia did not cry. She nodded as if receiving communion. Nathaniel lay on a pallet in the hall, fevered from blood loss, muttering Adrian's phrases between delirious gasps. James hid under the staircase, clutching his ears. Adrian was taken to the county jail. People expected a grand trial. What happened instead was quieter and worse. Within a week, Adrian was found dead in his cell. The sheriff said it was suicide. He said Adrian tore a strip from his shirt and hanged himself from the window bars. But the deputy who told me the news would not meet my eyes. He said the body had bruises that looked like a beating. He said the jailer had visited Adrian late, and after that visit, Adrian's voice was heard chanting through the stone halls until morning. Then silence. No inquest was held. The county did not want to examine the death of a tutor who had touched a wealthy family and stirred talk of slave rebellion. They called it closed. The church called it unfortunate. The truth was buried with him in unmarked ground. But a buried thing does not always stay buried. The Harmon household did not heal. Nathaniel survived his wound, but the bullet had shattered part of his shoulder, and with it, perhaps, a piece of his certainty. In the weeks after Adrian's death, he would wake screaming that Ada's hands were pulling him into black water. He begged his father to forgive him. Then at other times he would sit quietly and repeat that Ada's sacrifice was necessary and that Adrian would return. He swung between remorse and devotion, like a pendulum that could not find rest. Lydia was worse. She refused to speak of Adrian as anything but a martyr. She accused her mother of betrayal and me of demonic interference. She said the household had been chosen and that the chosen were always tested by cowards. Eliza sank into a grief that looked like illness. She blamed herself for inviting Adrian into their home. She blamed Augustus for not acting sooner. She blamed me for leaving. She blamed God for allowing such a man to wear refinement like a bishop's robe. She stopped eating. She stayed in her room with curtains drawn, even at midday. James, the youngest, drifted in a different direction. He did not cling to devotion the way Lydia did, or to guilt the way Nathaniel did. He went quiet, deeply quiet, the kind of quiet that is not peace but vacancy. When I tried to speak with him about Ada, he asked me if people drowned could still hear prayers. I told him, God heard all things. James nodded as if filing that away. Then he asked if wolves went to heaven. I said wolves were animals, neither blessed nor damned. James frowned and said, Mr. Blackwood said we are wolves when we choose to be. He said wolves go where they want after. I had no answer for a child dragged through such poison. Augustus tried to reclaim authority. He dismissed 2 overseers who had followed Nathaniel's orders. He forbade the children from entering the quarters without supervision. He ordered the lane padlocked at night. He asked me to stay on permanently as moral guardian. I agreed because leaving again felt like murder. Yet even with me present, the house felt haunted by a living memory. Adrian's books remained in the library. Augustus wanted to burn them. Lydia hid one under her mattress and another in the attic. I found them once and removed them. She found ways to replace them. It was like pulling weeds from a garden where the soil itself had been cursed. The enslaved people lived in fear of retaliation from the county. Ben was jailed for weeks. The Harmons paid a fine to have him returned. Not as mercy, but because Augustus knew the plantation could not run without him. Ben came back thinner and quieter, eyes hard as river stones. He did not speak of Adrian again. He did not need to. Ada Little Shoe was buried beside the chapel with no marker, because enslaved graves were never marked by law. Millie came to that spot every evening to sit in the grass and hum Ada's favorite, Lullaby. I prayed with her often. I never stopped seeing the sinkhole when I closed my eyes. Autumn came. The war rumors thickened. Soldiers marched in Charleston streets, and men spoke of secession openly. On the plantation, the pressure of the world outside did what pressure often does. It widened the cracks. Nathaniel, wanting to prove himself despite his wound, began drilling with a local militia. He spoke less about Adrian's philosophy, but more about blood and destiny. Lydia watched him drill and smiled. She had found a new language for her devotion. She began speaking about saints of the South and martyrs of the coming fight. I heard her in the kitchen telling James that Ada was not dead because she had become part of their strength. She told him he must honor her by never doubting again. James stared at her a long time and then said nothing. I worried about what silence meant. In late October, I rode into Charleston for supplies and returned 2 days later to find the plantation in another crisis. Eliza was gone. Her bedroom window was open. Her shawl had been left neatly on the bed. Her slippers were still on the rug. The river was low and glassy in the cold morning light. We searched fields, barns, the swamp path. I found her 2 miles away near the sinkhole, lying beside the black water with her hands folded like she had arranged herself for burial. Her throat was not cut. There were no wounds. But her lips were blue, and her eyes were open in a fixed stare at the sky. She had swallowed something. Perhaps laudanum from her medicine drawer, perhaps herbs from the garden. I knelt in the mud and tried to pray, but my throat closed. Augustus arrived behind me and made a sound I had never heard a grown man make. A cry, halfway between grief and rage. Lydia approached last. She looked down at her mother's body and did not cry. She said she could not withstand the trial. She said it softly, like a lesson recited. Augustus slapped her so hard she fell. He yelled that her mother was dead, because of Adrian and because of Lydia's blind devotion. Lydia lifted her head slowly and said, "Father, you struck me like a slave. You are losing your place." Augustus froze. He looked at his daughter as if she were a stranger. A week after Eliza's burial, Augustus sent Lydia to stay with her aunt in Charleston. He did it both to protect her from further influence and to protect the household from her influence. Lydia left without protest. She kissed James' forehead before departing and whispered something into his ear that made him tremble. I did not hear it, and I still regret that I did not. She rode away in a black carriage, her eyes forward, her mouth a thin line of certainty. The big house quieted after that. It was a quieter kind of horror, like the hush after a sermon when everyone knows their sins but no one speaks them. Nathaniel grew more like his father in posture, but not in spirit. He tried to help with accounts, with field decisions, with militia responsibilities. Yet at night I heard him pacing his room. Sometimes I heard him whispering to someone who was not there. Once I rose quietly and listened at his door. He was saying, "I did what you asked. I was strong. You said it would make me clean. Why do I still see her?" He did not say Adrian's name. He did not need to. James began to sleepwalk. He would rise at midnight, eyes open but empty, and walk the hallway toward the library. I caught him twice and guided him back to bed. The third time I followed him silently. He went into the library, climbed onto a chair, and reached for a high shelf where Adrian's favorite books had been. Most were gone, stored away by Augustus. But James found a thin journal hidden behind a row of histories. He pulled it out and opened it with trembling fingers. I stepped forward and took it from him gently. He did not resist. He looked up at me with a face that was not angry or frightened, only tired. He asked me if I knew what a door was. I told him many things were doors. He said Adrian told him he was the door. He said Adrian told him that a family could not be remade without a child who could open the way. He said Ada was the key that opened him. I asked what he meant. James blinked slowly, and for the first time in months I saw a child in his eyes. He said he did not know. He said he only felt like something was waiting behind his ribs. I held him for a long time in that library until his body stopped shaking. The journal I took from him was Adrian's personal writing. It was not a lesson notebook. It was a plan. In it, he described the Harmon family as a vessel for an experiment in moral transformation. He wrote about teaching heirs that violence was not cruelty when performed for order. He wrote about making Lydia a priestess of his ideas, a future matron who would shape generations. He wrote about using James' sensitivity as a doorway into the deeper work, because he believed certain children could be hollowed into conduits for will. He wrote about testing the family through sacrifice, starting with those society would not mourn. He wrote that the war would provide cover for larger purges. He wrote he had done this before, in smaller households, but never with a plantation so ripe for scale. He did not write where he came from or who taught him or why he wore refinement like a mask. But the handwriting carried a joy that made me nauseous. When I showed the journal to Augustus, his face went gray. He said he had let a madman sit at his table. He said he had witnessed his own children become strangers. He asked if he could ever pull them back. I told him guilt could become a chain, but also a guide. I told him he needed to do two things. He needed to confess publicly to the county that Ada and Charity deaths were murders incited by Adrian, and he needed to free the families in the quarters who had suffered under that evil. Augustus listened. He said public confession would ruin him. He said freeing slaves would make him a pariah, even among men he already despised. I told him he had already lost his wife and his innocence. I told him the only redemption left was to stop pretending order mattered more than human life. He stared at me a long while, and then he nodded. The confession never happened. Not fully. Augustus tried. In November, he rode to the county seat, with Adrian's journal under his arm. He asked to meet Sheriff Langley. The sheriff received him politely and listened to part of the story, then closed the door and lowered his voice. He told Augustus that if this became public, it would ignite panic across low country. It would suggest enslaved people had been murdered by heirs and that the law had failed to stop it. It would provoke whispers of rebellion and provide ammunition to northern abolitionists. He told Augustus that in times like these, families handled their own stains in private. He suggested Augustus destroy the journal and say nothing. Augustus argued. The sheriff finally grew cold. He said, "Your family is already on thin ice after a tutor's death in custody. If you push this, the county will call for your land to be seized and your slaves sold to cover damages. And they will not be gentle about how they brand your son." Augustus returned defeated. He burned the journal in the hearth that night, but I had copied enough of it in my own hand to keep the truth alive. Augustus did free some people quietly. He manumitted Millie and Rose and their kin through a hidden arrangement with a Charleston lawyer. He did it without public ceremony, calling it a financial necessity. The rest remained. It was imperfect mercy, but mercy all the same in a system built to starve it. Winter came with a hard frost. The war finally erupted in open declarations. Nathaniel enlisted despite his shoulder. Augustus did not stop him. He said perhaps the battlefield would burn out what Adrian had planted. Nathaniel left in January 1858 with a militia unit bound for training near Columbia. Before he left, he came to the chapel room and knelt beside me. He wept like a boy again, not a wolf. He asked if God could forgive him for Ada. I told him forgiveness was possible but demanded truth and changed life. He nodded. He said he would never forget Ada's name. He promised he would not follow any voice but conscience again. I watched him ride away under a cold sky. I wished I believed his promise would hold against the horrors he had not yet seen. The months that followed were quiet on the plantation. Too quiet for a place that had held so much shouting. James grew slowly more present. He began helping in the garden with Eliza's old tools. He began asking me about scripture again, but the questions were darker. He asked whether souls could be stolen. He asked whether a man could leave a shadow behind, to live in others. I told him influence could linger like smoke in walls, but it was not stronger than love and truth. He listened as if weighing the words. Some nights he still walked in his sleep, but now he came to my room instead of the library. He would sit by the door and whisper, "I am not a door anymore. Tell me I am not." I would tell him. I would tell him until his breathing slowed. That spring, Lydia returned for a visit. She was taller, her face sharper. She wore black as if already a widow. She greeted her father with polite distance, me with a glance like an appraisal, and James with a long embrace that made his shoulders stiff. At dinner, she spoke about Charleston sermons she had been attending, about patriotic duty, about women who must be strong for the South. I watched her carefully. She seemed outwardly normal. Yet when a servant spilled a bit of wine near her elbow, Lydia smiled and said, "Clumsiness is a kind of filth." The servant apologized profusely. Lydia told her to kneel and pray for forgiveness. It was a small cruelty, but it carried Adrian's voice in it like a note in a chord. After dinner, I found Lydia in the library alone, standing before the empty shelf where Adrian's books had once sat. She ran her fingers over the dust outline. She did not hear me enter. She whispered, "You said I would be the vessel." I kept my part. "Why did you leave?" There was no one else in the room. I spoke her name softly. She turned. For a moment, I saw a flicker of shame. Then she lifted her chin and asked if I had come to scold her. I said I had come to ask whether she truly understood what Adrian had done. She replied that Adrian had opened their eyes to the world as it was, not as mothers wished it to be. She said, Ada's death was regrettable, but necessary. She said weakness had killed her mother, not Adrian. I told her mother died because her heart could not carry the weight of a tutor's poison. Lydia shrugged and said, poison and medicine were often the same substance. I told her she sounded like him. She smiled. She said perhaps that meant he had succeeded. She left the next morning. James watched her carriage vanish and then vomited in the grass. Later, he told me she had whispered in his ear before leaving. He said she told him that a door once opened never fully closes, and that someday Adrian would come through him again. I held his face in my hands and told him she was wrong. I believed it when I said it, but belief is not always enough. In late summer, news arrived that Nathaniel had been killed in a skirmish near the Congaree. The letter was brief. It said he died bravely. It did not mention his last words. Augustus read the letter without expression. Then he walked to the river alone. I followed at a distance. He stood at the dock where Isaiah's body had been found and stared into the water for a long time. When he finally spoke, he said he had lost his son twice. Once to a tutor, once to a war. He asked me if God punished men through their children. I said God did not punish like men did, but consequences could feel like punishment. He nodded slowly. He said he wanted to sell the plantation and leave Low Country forever. He said the land felt cursed. I told him perhaps leaving would be mercy for everyone. He did sell. Not immediately, but within a year. The war economy made buyers hungry. A rice consortium purchased Harmon fields and quarters. Augustus moved to Charleston with James and a few remaining servants. Lydia did not follow them. She had married a Charleston merchant who shared her zeal for hard purity. We never spoke again. Before Augustus left, he went to Millie cabin and told her she was free to go north if she wished. She looked at him and asked where a mother goes when her child is buried in black water. Augustus had no answer. Millie chose to stay near Ada's grave until the consortium forced her out. Augustus gave me Eliza pearl brooch to donate to the parish. He said it belonged to a woman who had loved too gently for the world she lived in. I took it and still keep it in a small box, because some relics are warnings. James grew into a quiet man. He studied in Charleston, first with me, later with other priests. He never went to university. He never married. He had a gift for drawing and often sketched doorways in churches, archways in shadow, windows half open. When he was 20, he asked to join the clergy, not as a priest, but as a lay brother to help with the sick. He said he wanted to spend his life closing doors for people too weak to close them alone. I asked him if he still felt Adrian inside him. He thought a long time and said there were days he heard a whisper when candlelight flickered, but he had learned to answer it with his own voice. He said the whisper was smaller now, like a ghost starved of attention. I told him that was how evil dies. Not all at once, but from hunger. Some years later, after the war ended and Low Country began its long, bleeding rebuild, I heard a rumor that chilled me more than any swamp story. I heard that Lydia Harmon's husband had died suddenly, found in his study with a clean cut across his throat, and that Lydia had told neighbors God had taken him to wash away his filth. The county called it a burglary. No one questioned further. In my bones, I heard Adrian laugh again. I do not know if Lydia killed her husband. I do know she had been trained to see murder as cleansing, and that training does not vanish because the tutor body is buried. It moves through blood and lessons and whispered certainties. That is why I wrote this account. Because a man like Adrian Blackwood does not need to survive to win. He only needs to plant the idea that love and violence are the same gift. The Harmon plantation is gone now. Its big house torn down by storms decades ago. The sinkhole still sits out there in the swamp. People say it is bottomless. People say lights glimmer on its surface on certain nights. I do not know about lights. I do know that whenever I travel that road, I smell cypress rot and hear a faint children's laugh, and I remember a blue ribbon on a branch. If there is any lesson in all this, it is not that monsters look monstrous. Adrian was refined, educated, gentle to the ear. He spoke of virtue while teaching cruelty. He spoke of duty while hollowing children into tools. He did what many tyrants do. He entered through trust and left through blood. The church failed to stop him early because we respected wealth and privacy more than we respected the vulnerable. The law failed because it served order above truth. The Harmons failed because they let fear of chaos become a gateway for a man who promised certainty at any cost. Ada and Isaiah and Charity paid for that failure with their lives. Eliza paid with her heart. Nathaniel paid with his soul before the war ever took his body. James survived, but survival is not the same as innocence. I cannot give you a neat ending because real horror does not wrap itself in a bow. But I can tell you this. I have seen evil come into houses on boots and bayonets, yes, but I have also seen it come with books and compliments, with soft laughter behind a parlor door. And I have learned that if you ever hear a voice teaching children that mercy is weakness, you do not wait for iron proof. You stop it then, even if the world calls you hysterical. Because by the time you find the shoe in the mud, the lesson has already been written in blood.